A sealed letter. A splash of ink. And suddenly, a hidden crime bleeds through the page. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Tell me, where are you watching from as we uncover this case? Your presence makes every clue worth chasing. It was on one of those bleak January mornings when the wind raked the soot-blackened rooftops of London, with a chill bite of steel, that I found myself once more ensconced in my old quarters at 2121B Baker Street. A fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the dreary dampness outside, and Sherlock Holmes stood silhouetted at the window, his dressing gown hanging loosely about his lean frame, eyes fixed on the fog-draped street below. He had been in one of his thoughtful moods since breakfast, alternating between a morose silence and sudden bursts of violin playing that ranged from plaintive to frenetic. I had learned not to interrupt him in such moods. They often preceded the arrival of some intriguing puzzle or unusually complex client. "You observe nothing," Holmes said abruptly, still staring through the glass. "I beg your pardon?" The man about to ascend the stairs. Note his limp war wound, left leg, and the ink stain upon his right cuff. A man of writing habit, recently returned from the continent, and evidently troubled enough to seek us out on a Sunday morning. He will knock now. There came a knock at the door. I glanced at Holmes with something between exasperation and awe. "You must have seen him before." "Not at all, but the street speaks to those who know its language." Mrs. Hudson showed in a short, well-dressed gentleman, in his early 50s, with sharp gray eyes and a mustache that twitched nervously as he removed his gloves. He moved with the careful gait of one accustomed to compensating for pain. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, glancing between the two of us. Holmes gestured to the chair closest to the fire. "You are Major Archibald Bracknell, formerly of the 21st Lancers. You have recently returned from service in Cairo and are currently residing in Kensington. You compose, or rather composed, letters for the Colonial Office, though I dare say that's not what brings you here today." The Major stared in astonishment. "Good Lord, sir, that's correct. To every syllable." Watson could not suppress a smile. Holmes waved it aside impatiently. "Your gait, your tan, the cut of your mustache, all military. The style of your hat indicates Kensington. The faint smell of antique ink suggests office work. Your left boot has sand ingrained in the creases, but only recently. Cairo. Now, sir, to business. You are distressed." Major Bracknell leaned forward. "I am, and not merely distressed, Mr. Holmes. I am terrified. A man has died, and I believe he was murdered. Worse, I believe the method of his murder may pass entirely unnoticed if no one examines the true nature of the ink he used before his death." Watson leaned in. "Ink, you say?" "Yes. There is something strange, diabolical even, about it. My friend Harold Phipps, a scholar and recluse, was found dead at his writing desk 3 nights ago. Officially, they've ruled it a heart attack. Natural causes, but I know better." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Go on." There was a letter in front of him, half-written. Phipps was composing a rebuttal to a certain Professor Mordaunt, someone he'd accused of academic fraud. The letter was strange, more fragmented than usual, and most peculiar was the ink itself, redder than any I'd seen. It looked like blood. Watson gave a low whistle. "I thought it nonsense at first, until I went to the inkwell myself and found it empty. Scrubbed clean, as if someone had removed the contents deliberately. I took the blotter to a chemist friend. He said the red substance had traces of hemoglobin. Actual blood." Watson asked incredulously. "Yes, mixed with ink. A hybrid substance. Now, I may be no man of science, but I served long enough to recognize the reek of something foul beneath a pristine surface. I went to Scotland Yard, but they brushed me off." Holmes rose from his chair, all signs of languor gone from his frame. "Major, your instinct may have saved a great truth from being buried with your friend. Blood, ink, a letter of accusation, and a cleaned inkwell. This is no ordinary death. I shall visit the scene immediately." "Watson, your coat." "Gladly," I said, fetching it with a jolt of excitement I had not felt in some weeks. "Where are we headed, Major?" "To the Phipps residence, gentlemen, in Bloomsbury. And I fear what you find there may be more chilling than you imagine." As the fog thickened outside and the fire hissed behind us, we followed Major Bracknell into the grey London morning, unaware that the trail we were about to tread would lead through deception, revenge, and the hidden meaning behind words that bled. The hansom cab clattered through the narrow streets of Bloomsbury, the wheels hissing against the damp cobblestones. Holmes, cloaked in a long grey ulster, sat in focused silence, his hawk-like features sharper than usual beneath the shadow of his deerstalker. I sat opposite him, notebook at the ready, though my mind was more preoccupied with the peculiar details Major Bracknell had shared than with recording Holmes' movements, as I had done on countless other occasions. The very notion of ink composed partly of blood was grotesque, but the implications were worse still. The notion of such a substance being used to pen an accusatory letter before a man's death could only mean one thing. It was a message, either intended or interrupted. Someone had wanted to silence Phipps, and if so, perhaps they had succeeded, with an unnerving blend of artistry and malice. The cab halted in front of a somber row of Georgian houses, their facades coated with grime and memories. Bracknell led us up the steps of number 47 and rapped twice upon the door. It was opened by a housekeeper in a black wool dress, her red-rimmed eyes betraying a recent cry. "Mrs. Cowlishaw," Bracknell said gently, "these gentlemen are here about Mr. Phipps. Please, may we come in?" She nodded mutely, stepping aside as we entered the dim hallway. A grandfather clock ticked with funereal rhythm, and the smell of old paper and pipe smoke still clung faintly to the air. "The study, if you please," Holmes said, not unkindly. We were led down a short corridor to a heavy oak door. Bracknell opened it slowly, and we entered the study of Harold Phipps. The room had been left largely untouched. Books lined the walls in precarious stacks, and manuscripts littered the desk like fallen leaves. The fire had gone out long ago, and a ghostly chill lingered in the air. The chair behind the desk remained where it had been found, angled slightly askew. I could almost picture Phipps seated there, pen in hand, caught in the act of writing when death crept upon him. Holmes stepped forward, drawing on a pair of thin gloves. He moved with feline precision, eyes scanning the scene with the quick, darting attention of a man mentally cataloguing every object and its position. He paused at the desk. "This is the letter?" he asked. Bracknell nodded, and indicated the half-written page atop the blotter. His final words, "See for yourself." Holmes bent over the paper. I joined him, my curiosity piqued. The sheet bore a few lines written in a flowing, confident hand. But the ink, as Bracknell had claimed, was of a sinister hue. It was a deep, rusty crimson, unlike any standard ink I had encountered. To accuse a man like Professor Mordaunt of such scholarly theft is no small matter. Yet I possess the documentary proof. If this reaches the Royal Academic Society before his rebuttal, he will have no. The line trailed off. The pen had skidded, leaving a final downward stroke that tapered weakly. Was there a rebuttal? Holmes asked sharply. Bracknell shook his head. No letter from Mordaunt had surfaced, but he had written to Harold recently, vehemently denying the accusation and threatening to sue for defamation if Harold proceeded. Holmes lifted the blotter and studied its impressions. The pressure here is uneven. The early lines were written with authority, the final ones with a trembling hand, and no sign of any ink bottle. "None," Bracknell said. "That's what struck me. Phipps always used a heavy ceramic inkwell, navy blue, chipped at the base. It was missing when I arrived. I assumed the police had taken it, but they claimed otherwise." Holmes crouched suddenly and examined the floor near the desk. "Ha! Look here, Watson." A faint ring upon the carpet. Circular, narrow, no doubt where the inkwell stood. You'll observe the fibers are flattened as if from recent weight, but no ink stains, suggesting the inkwell was removed carefully, I said. Precisely. And not by the housekeeper, I presume? Holmes asked, turning to Mrs. Cowlishaw, who had hovered quietly in the doorway. No, sir. I never touched the master's desk. He hated interference. I left him tea that evening just before dusk. When I came to check on him after supper, he was, she faltered, then continued bravely. He was gone, slumped forward, just as you see the chair now. The doctor said his heart gave out. Holmes nodded slowly. Did Mr. Phipps have visitors that day? Mrs. Cowlishaw hesitated. Only one, sir, a young woman. Arrived in a hurry just past 4 o'clock. Said she was from the publishing house. She didn't give her name, but she was well dressed and spoke very precisely. She was here less than 10 minutes. Did she enter the study? I asked. I believe so. Mr. Phipps was shouting about proof and plagiarism just before she left. He often got worked up over his arguments with Professor Mordaunt. Holmes tapped the desk lightly. A visitor bearing a false identity, a missing inkwell, a letter written in blood, and a death ruled natural. Watson, I believe the next step is clear. To visit this Professor Mordaunt. In time, yes. But first, I should like to examine the chemist who tested this ink. You mentioned a name, Major. Thomas Ellicott. He owns a private laboratory in Camden Town. A brilliant if eccentric fellow. I took the blotter scrap there the morning after Harold's death. And what was his conclusion? That the ink was adulterated with blood. But he couldn't determine whose. He said it could have been Phipps's, but he couldn't be certain. Then I shall speak to Mr. Ellicott directly. There is something about this concoction that troubles me, Watson. Ink is for writing. Blood is for violence. Their combination is no accident. It is a message. And what do you suppose the message is? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. That Mr. Phipps may have tried to expose a lie, but died before he could deliver the truth. Someone ensured his words would never be finished, but I intend to finish them for him. As we turned to leave the study, I cast one final glance at the letter, the crimson ink like dried wounds on the page. Somewhere in that half-finished sentence lay the key to the mystery, and no doubt, to the hand that had crafted a most unnatural silence. The journey to Camden Town was a short one, yet the carriage ride was steeped in silence. Holmes sat rigid, his fingers drumming softly on his knee as his thoughts roamed the labyrinthine corridors of deduction. I could see the pattern forming in his mind, though he gave no voice to it yet. When he was in this state, absorbed, remote, even my most well-meant inquiries were unlikely to draw anything more than a distracted grunt. As we turned to leave the study, I cast one final glance at the letter, the crimson ink like dried wounds on the page. Somewhere in that half-finished sentence lay the key to the mystery, and no doubt, to the hand that had crafted a most unnatural silence. We arrived just after midday. Camden's narrow lanes buzzed with street vendors and the clatter of carts, but Holmes paid no heed to the bustle. He led the way down a quieter lane, where soot-darkened buildings gave way to a narrow shopfront. A flaking sign above the door read, "Ted. I am. And you are." Ellicott's eyes lit with interest. Ah, the curious ink. Yes, I remember. Most unusual case. Follow me, please. He gestured us into a back room where several workbenches were arranged haphazardly. A microscope sat in the center, surrounded by petri dishes, glass slides, and curious stains. He rifled through a drawer and produced a small glass vial, half filled with a congealed reddish substance. This is what remained after I extracted the residue from the blotter, he said, handing it to Holmes. At first glance, I assumed it was simply red ink. A rare variant, perhaps, or one of those antiquated formulas using cochineal, but when I ran a simple test for proteins, the results were unmistakable. Blood, Holmes said. Correct. Human blood. Though I cannot determine the blood type without more material, and certainly not the identity of the individual, but it had been mixed with ink in such a precise ratio that it retained the viscosity and flow of standard writing fluid. Could it have been done accidentally? I asked. Impossible, Ellicott replied. The process was deliberate. The sample contained stabilizers, gum arabic, most likely to prevent clotting. Whoever created it knew what they were doing. Holmes examined the vial under the light. And the ink component, could you trace its origin? Only generally, Ellicott said. It resembles a blend manufactured by a small German firm. Dresden, I believe, not something you'd find in a local stationer's, expensive, imported. Definitely not common. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. You have been most helpful, Mr. Ellicott. One final question. If someone had, shall we say, sustained a small wound and attempted to use their own blood to finish a message, would the result resemble this? Ellicott shook his head firmly. Not unless they were a chemist. Blood dries too quickly, congeals. It would smear, not flow. This was prepared in advance. As we stepped back into the street, Holmes allowed himself a brief flicker of satisfaction. We now know 3 important facts. Watson. 1. The ink was no spontaneous creation. 2. It was composed with scientific skill. And 3. It is exceedingly rare, which narrows the list of potential preparers significantly. You believe the killer made the ink. I believe someone created it with a precise purpose. And since it was used on a letter that Phipps was composing in anger, we must ask, did he write with the ink unknowingly, or did someone else take up the pen? But the blotter bore his handwriting. So it appeared. But consider this. What if the letter were forged, or partially forged? If someone wanted to manufacture evidence of a natural death, they might forge a letter that appears coherent, but is subtly false. Yet in this case the ink itself draws attention, that is the contradiction. We had walked only a few paces before Holmes turned sharply. To Bloomsbury, Watson. I wish to speak with the housekeeper again. Something she said troubles me. We found Mrs. Cowlishaw in the sitting room, darning gloves in the wan afternoon light. She rose nervously at our return. Mrs. Cowlishaw, Holmes said gently, when you said that Mr. Phipps shouted about plagiarism after the young lady left, are you certain the remark occurred after she departed? She hesitated. Now that you mention it, sir. No, I believe he was still speaking when she was on the stair. He raised his voice, perhaps to ensure she heard him. Thank you. That will be all. We withdrew to the hallway. Holmes's expression had sharpened. You see, Watson, the housekeeper believed the visitor was a publishing agent. But what if she was not? What if her purpose was not to collect a manuscript, but to plant one? But how would she have gained access to the ink? She wouldn't need to. She may have brought it with her, already prepared. A fake letter, half composed, to give the impression of a dying scholar, racing to finish a final warning. But the details don't fit. The ink is theatrical, too precise, and Phipps' manner shouting about plagiarism to a supposed agent. It reeks of staged provocation. Then you believe the letter was a forgery. Possibly. Or a blend. Perhaps part genuine, part fabricated. But the inkwell was removed. That is the clearest indication that someone wished to erase the process by which the words appeared. And now we must ask, who stood to benefit from Harold Phipps' silence? He stopped abruptly, drawing a card from his pocket. This is the address of Professor Mordaunt. We must confront him. Not with accusation, not yet, but with questions only the guilty would fear. The address took us to a rather elegant flat, overlooking Lincoln's Inn Fields. A footman answered the bell, and returned moments later with word that Professor Mordaunt would see us. We were ushered into a large study, book-lined, fragrant with pipe tobacco, and flooded with afternoon light. A man of middle age and immense self-assurance rose to greet us. He wore a velvet jacket, and had the appearance of someone who relished authority. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, to what do I owe the honor? Professor Mordaunt, Holmes said, offering a brief bow. We are investigating the death of your colleague Harold Phipps. Tragic, Mordaunt said, though there was no trace of sorrow in his voice. But not surprising, the man was a lunatic. I warned the board of the Royal Society years ago. Did you correspond recently? Mordaunt's gaze sharpened slightly. We exchanged a few formal letters. He made wild accusations. I responded through proper channels. And you threatened legal action. I did. His claims were defamatory and baseless. Why? Because, Holmes said evenly, it appears that Mr. Phipps died in the process of penning one last message, a letter addressed to the Royal Society, naming you directly. For the first time, Mordaunt's confidence faltered. Holmes continued, voice cool and precise. You may not be surprised to learn that the ink he used was composed in part of human blood. Mordaunt's eyes narrowed. What sort of game is this? No game, Holmes said. And I would caution you to consider your next statements very carefully. Any discrepancy in your account from this point forward will be noted. Mordaunt's hands tightened behind his back. Then I shall say only this. I did not kill Harold Phipps, and I certainly had no interest in what ink he used. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Very well. Good day, Professor. I expect we shall speak again soon. As we left the flat, I glanced at Holmes. You believe he's lying? About something, Holmes replied. But he is too practiced to show his hand outright. No, Watson. We need a more pliable witness, someone close to the victim, yet on the periphery. And who might that be? Holmes smiled faintly. The publisher's clerk, who sent the mysterious visitor. If she exists, we shall begin our inquiries in Fleet Street. Someone there will know which agent was sent to Phipps' house, or if any was sent at all. It was nearly 4 o'clock when we arrived on Fleet Street, the sun already sinking into a haze that lent the city a golden haze tinged with grime. The thoroughfare bustled with the energy of the press. Boys dashed to and fro with proofs, carriages waited for editors and typesetters, and the heavy clang of metal presses echoed from side alleys where print shops churned out broadsheets by the thousand. Holmes surveyed the surroundings with his usual detachment, though I could see his eyes flitting sharply from sign to sign. We proceeded to Merton and Haddock Publishers, a respectable establishment dealing chiefly in academic volumes, biographies, and the sort of slow-selling, well-reviewed books that lent a reputation more than a profit. Harold Phipps had published with them before. We had confirmed this through the card in his study. Inside, the office was paneled in walnut and smelled faintly of varnish and drying ink. A clerk behind the front desk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that caught the lamplight, looked up as we approached. Good afternoon, Holmes said, with polite briskness. We are here regarding a visit made to Mr. Harold Phipps's residence 3 evenings ago. A young woman claimed to represent this firm. I should like to speak with your manager, or better yet, your office dispatch record. The man frowned. A representative? We don't typically send anyone to authors' homes unless a manuscript is being collected by arrangement. Might I ask who inquires? Holmes passed him a card. That name, Sherlock Holmes, had a curious way of accelerating cooperation. The clerk vanished without another question, and returned shortly, with a balding, earnest-faced man who introduced himself as Mr. Gellibrand, the assistant editor. No such visit was authorized, Gellibrand said after hearing the details. We've had no need to call upon Mr. Phipps directly in some months. If someone claimed to be from our firm, they did so falsely. And was he working on anything new? I asked. Anything connected to Professor Mordaunt or his recent accusations? Not that we were aware of, Gellibrand replied. Mr. Phipps had submitted no new manuscripts to us since last year. He'd expressed interest in a second volume of his studies in Aramaic texts, but nothing came of it. Holmes tapped a finger lightly against his walking stick. Would you be so good as to show me your staff list, particularly your female staff, those who work on external dispatch or author correspondence? Gellibrand obliged, producing a ledger with names and schedules. Holmes reviewed it silently, then turned it to me. Not one entry matched a visit to Bloomsbury that day. A delivery had gone out to a printer in Lambeth and a typesetter in Chiswick, but no one, especially no female clerk or agent, had been assigned to visit Phipps. Then our visitor was an impostor, Holmes concluded, and she wished to be mistaken for someone from this office. That is telling. Gellibrand looked alarmed. You believe someone used our name to gain his trust, or at least his attention. It would not be difficult to mimic the formal manner and appearance of your staff, particularly if one had studied your correspondence or visited the office in advance. I presume Mr. Phipps's past communications with your firm might have been intercepted. We corresponded with him by post, naturally, Gellibrand said. All our authors do. Holmes gave a sharp nod. Then it is possible someone close to Phipps, someone with access to his letters, anticipated your style and forged the persona. We left shortly after. The late afternoon, now thickening into evening. A light drizzle had begun to fall, and gas lamps flared in pools along the curbs. I pulled my coat tighter as we hailed a cab. Holmes remained standing as it arrived, deep in thought. She wore the mask of professionalism, he said finally, as we climbed in. She knew how to avoid questions, limit her time, leave no name. Her purpose was singular, to be remembered just enough to plant the idea that she was legitimate, and to deliver something, not take. That suggests this was a message of control, not collection. Could it have been the forged letter itself? I asked. Handed to him, perhaps under the guise of it being a draft to edit. Possibly. Or it was slipped into place after his death. Either way, the inkwell is the missing piece. It links the false ink to the death. And now we must ask, who had both the knowledge and the motive to create such an elaborate deception? Professor Mordaunt? Holmes was quiet for a moment. He is certainly involved, but his personality suggests a man who guards his reputation rather than soils his hands. No, he has an agent, someone clever, loyal and willing to act without orders on his behalf, someone who sees Phipps as a threat to the professor's standing. But who? Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled from his coat pocket the blotter fragment we had retrieved from Phipps's desk, carefully folded in a wax envelope. I believe the answer lies in this ink, he said, and in a very particular pattern of handwriting. We returned to Baker Street where Holmes wasted no time. He placed the blotter under a strong lamp and retrieved a small case of magnifying glasses and templates. For nearly an hour he made no sound, scanning loops, tails and stems of each letter, as a jeweler inspects gems for flaws. I occupied myself with a medical journal, though I occasionally cast glances at his taut expression. At last, he sat back and let out a quiet breath. Well? I asked. There are discrepancies, he said. Look here. The curvature of the M in Mordaunt does not match Phipps's usual form. His hand was firm. See the earlier lines, but by the time the accusation is written, the slant changes. More pressure, more flourish, a different hand mimicking his but imperfectly. A forgery, then. A forgery, or an addition, Holmes said. One that transformed a mere rebuttal into a direct condemnation. I stared. Then the entire purpose of the letter was to give Mordaunt motive, or to frame him. More likely to obscure motive. Holmes said. Imagine this. Someone kills Phipps, not for what he has said, but for what he hasn't yet said. They need a distraction, something that points all suspicion in one direction, while they slip away unnoticed. And that someone could be close to both men. Just so. A secretary, perhaps. A former student. An editor. Someone who knew both their work, who understood academic jealousy and personal ambition, and could imitate a script convincingly. There was a pause. I realized with a tightening sense of apprehension that we were no longer discussing theory, but narrowing the suspects. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall return to Bloomsbury, Holmes said. There is one room in Phipps's house we did not fully search, the upstairs study where he kept his personal correspondence. If the impostor knew what to forge, she may have learned it from there, and if we find no proof, then we shall pay another visit to Professor Mordaunt, this time with a different name on our lips. Whoever the woman was, she made one mistake. She assumed no one would question a well-dressed clerk carrying nothing but lies. He sat back, his fingers once again steepled, and his gaze distant. Outside, the rain continued, and London muttered softly beneath its veil of mist. By the time we arrived once more at number 47 Bloomsbury the next morning, The rain had given way to a brittle frost that painted the railings and window panes with fine silver. The city had resumed its hum of industry, but here, house remained quiet, its curtains drawn and atmosphere still weighted by the memory of Harold Phipps's sudden death. Holmes, ever precise, knocked just twice, and waited. Miss Cowlishaw answered again, her expression both wary and confused at our return. "We shan't trouble you long," Holmes assured her. "We wish only to examine Mr. Phipps's private study, the one upstairs." The housekeeper hesitated. "It's locked, sir. He never allowed anyone in." Holmes produced a small brass key from his coat. "I found this tucked into the lining of his writing desk downstairs. I believe it unlocks that very room." Without further protest, she stepped aside. We ascended the creaking staircase to the upper landing. At the far end stood a plain white door, unassuming but notably free of dust around the handle, a door that had seen recent use. Holmes inserted the key, turned it with a crisp click, and the door swung open. We entered a room more austere than I'd anticipated. It bore none of the academic chaos of the study below. The shelves were sparsely populated, the desk near the window free of clutter. Everything was ordered, deliberate, but Holmes moved instantly to a small filing cabinet in the corner, already scanning the labels affixed to each drawer. "Correspondence," he murmured. "By name." He opened one drawer marked M and withdrew a thin bundle of envelopes bound with twine. "Letters from Mordaunt, some years old, others recent." He leafed through them quickly. "Here, this one is dated just 6 days before the professor's death, and it is remarkably civil." He held it out to me. I read it carefully. "My dear Harold, I cannot express how disappointed I am to hear that you continue to pursue these outlandish accusations. Your grasp of the material is, as ever, impressive, but I fear you are chasing ghosts. For the sake of our long acquaintance, let us avoid further public disagreement, perhaps a private meeting. I remain, sincerely." I looked up. "That's hardly the language of a man fearing imminent disgrace." "Exactly," Holmes replied, "and compare the handwriting to that of the supposed final letter on Phipps's blotter." He took out the wax envelope again and held both side by side. "Close, yes, but the slant differs. Here, the professor's hand curves left, but the blotter's entry shows a slight rightward lean. A clever forgery, but careless." I nodded. "Then the forger studied Mordaunt's writing, but not enough to replicate it precisely, or had only a sample to imitate. Now what do we have here?" Holmes had moved to a locked drawer within the desk. He produced his tool set, and within seconds the drawer was open. Inside lay only one item, a small red notebook. Its cover was creased, but its contents were pristine. Holmes flipped it open and began scanning pages. "Notes on publication disputes," he murmured. "References to primary sources. Here it is, a name. Clarissa Murch." He tapped the page. "Murch claims credit for 1847 transcription. Submitted via Mordaunt. No footnote acknowledgement. Must review original manuscripts at Society Archives." "Clarissa Murch?" I asked. Holmes was already leafing backward. "Here as well. Murch again, unpublished work cited by Mordaunt in Linguistic Bridges of the Levant, timeline suspicious." And once more, voice oddly familiar, "Encountered her once. Pie. That's all. No further detail." "Then she may have been the source of the accusations, or the person Phipps believed was being used," I said. "Or perhaps she was being erased." Holmes said grimly, "If Mordaunt or someone close to him had been appropriating her research, Phipps may have discovered the truth. Clarissa Murch becomes not merely a bystander, but a threat. Then she may be in danger as well." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sent 3 telegrams, one to the Royal Academic Society, one to the British Library, and one to a private research society based in Marylebone that occasionally published monographs by lesser-known contributors. Then we waited. It was early evening when the first reply came, delivered by a boy in a threadbare cap. Holmes opened the envelope and read silently. "Here we are. he said. Clarissa Murch, former research assistant to Professor Mordaunt, left her post under unclear circumstances 2 years ago. Now works part-time indexing manuscripts at the British Library's East Wing. She has a residential address in Kentish Town. We wasted no time. Within the hour we stood before a small, ivy-covered cottage on a quiet lane off Highgate Road. Lights glowed within, and Holmes knocked sharply. "Miss Murch?" Holmes asked. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are here regarding the death of Harold Phipps." The door opened further, and the woman before us stepped into full view. She was in her early 30s, her features pale, intelligent, and marked by fatigue. She wore no ornament, save for a fountain pen clipped to her blouse, and the ink smudges on her fingertips matched those I had seen on the blotter in Phipps's study. "You'd better come in," she said, "but if you're here to ask if I killed him, I didn't. Though someone may well think I did." We entered the front room, sparse but tidy, where a kettle hissed gently on the hob. Clarissa Murch motioned to 2 chairs. "I warned him," she said quietly. "I told Harold to stop. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right." And too loudly. "You believe he was silenced?" Holmes asked. She looked at him, eyes narrowed. "We do," Holmes replied. "We believe someone used your name or your work to frame an argument against Professor Mordaunt, then murdered Phipps before he could clarify the truth." Clarissa sat down heavily. "Then it's worse than I thought." "And Seppes?" I asked. He discovered the overlap while reviewing Mordaunt's citations for a lecture series. He contacted me. I confirmed his suspicions. I thought that would be the end of it, that Harold would handle it through the proper channels. Then he vanished. Holmes leaned forward. "Did you visit him last Thursday?" "No. I'd been planning to, but I received a letter from him the day before, telling me not to come, that he had everything he needed. I kept the letter." She crossed to a writing desk and retrieved it. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me. It was calm, concise, and written in a confident hand, the same as Phipps's authentic correspondence, not the wavering lines found on the blotter. "Then the letter on the blotter was false," I said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes murmured. "And if we find who wrote it, we find the killer." Clarissa looked between us. "I think I know who could have done it. Someone very close to Mordaunt. And to me, his current assistant, Eleanor Vane." Holmes' brow lifted. "The name is familiar." "It should be," Clarissa said bitterly. "She was once my understudy." The room fell into silence, broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock and the quiet hiss of steam escaping the kettle. Clarissa Murch sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of her modest drawing room. Holmes, however, had gone utterly still, not with indecision, but with the tension of a predator narrowing in on prey. "Eleanor Vane," Holmes repeated slowly, savoring the name like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "Tell me about her." Clarissa exhaled. "She came to Mordaunt's department as an undergraduate, eager, brilliant in her way, but unpolished. I took her under my wing, helped her navigate the archives. She was ambitious, dangerously so. When I left my post, I recommended her as my successor. I believed she would be careful with what she inherited." "And was she?" Holmes asked. Clarissa's lips thinned. "She took more than I gave her. I later learned she'd submitted papers containing long extracts from my early notes, observations I'd never published. The same patterns began to emerge in Mordaunt's newer work, ideas too mature for a novice, yet published under his name with her assistance. I suspect they worked together, knowingly or not, and she continued feeding him my insights." "You never confronted her?" "Not directly, but Harold did," she said. "He told me he'd written to her, asking for clarification about the original drafts of several articles attributed to Mordaunt. He believed she had either fabricated sources or destroyed them." I frowned. "And if she feared exposure, she would have reason to silence him before the accusations reached the society." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And with her academic standing tied to Mordaunt's, She would not be destroying a mere rival, she'd be defending a reputation she helped build. She's clever, Clarissa said, and poised. If you speak to her, you'll need more than questions. Holmes rose. We shall do better than that. We shall offer her what she most desires. Control of the narrative, a carefully baited hook, if you will. Clarissa stood as well. I'll do whatever is needed. Holmes turned to her with a rare note of approval. Then I shall need a sample of your handwriting. Enough to demonstrate familiarity with your phrasing, but nothing compromising. If Eleanor Vane forged the final lines of Harold Phipps's letter to implicate Mordaunt and distract from herself, she likely studied your earlier notes to simulate Phipps's suspicions. Clarissa moved at her desk again and pulled a small folder from a drawer. These are copies of annotated drafts Harold and I worked on, several with my marginal notes. Holmes accepted them and offered her a small, grateful nod. Excellent. That may be all we need. Dr. Watson and I shall pay Miss Vane a visit tomorrow morning. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the contents of the folder across the table beneath the gaslight. I watched as he methodically compared loops, ligatures, pressure marks. He held Clarissa's notes beside the forged blotter lines, and then again beside the authentic letters from Phipps and Mordaunt. There, he said at last. See this formation of the lowercase d. Clarissa's script uses an upward tail that hooks slightly to the left. It's unique. And now, look here. He tapped the forged line. Mordaunt will have no defense. The day here is not Phipps, nor Mordaunt's. It mimics Clarissa's style, imperfectly, as if the writer had seen it, absorbed it, but didn't fully control it. I stared. Then she forged the line using Clarissa's hand. Precisely. A subtle, almost unconscious theft, a residue of past study. If she used Clarissa's notes to mimic Phipps's argument, it stands to reason she absorbed some of Clarissa's form as well, and yet it proves nothing to Scotland Yard. Ah. Holmes smiled faintly. That is why we shall not go to them. Not yet. First, we confront the spider in her web. The following morning, we made our way once more to the refined quarters of Lincoln's Inn Fields. The same footman admitted us without question, and we were shown not to Professor Mordaunt's study this time, but to a small antechamber where Miss Eleanor Vane was said to be working. It was a sunlit room lined with books, and at its center, a narrow desk upon which a neat woman sat, her sleeves rolled precisely, her pen poised above a ledger. She looked up and smiled with cautious formality. She was in her late 20s, with pale hair drawn back into a tidy chignon and a complexion as smooth as unmarked vellum. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You wished to see me? Holmes bowed slightly. Miss Vane, thank you for receiving us. We are revisiting certain aspects of Harold Phipps's final days, particularly the academic disputes he pursued prior to his death. A flicker passed over her features. A tragic loss. He was zealous. Holmes inclined his head, and deeply committed to his principles. You were familiar with his accusations against Professor Mordaunt. Her posture stiffened. I was aware of his writings, yes, but I had no personal involvement. Curious, Holmes said, studying her with a gaze so placid it seemed almost distracted. Because your name appears several times in the personal notebook he kept in his locked upstairs study. You were, it seems, his subject of increasing interest. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. He may have believed I contributed to Professor Mordaunt's work. I assure you my role is strictly administrative. Then I'm sure you'll have no objection to clarifying a small inconsistency. A letter was found on Mr. Phipps's desk, purportedly written in the last minutes of his life, and yet the ink used was a mixture of cochineal and human blood. She blinked once. That's disturbing. Quite. But more disturbing is this. The handwriting bears unmistakable influence from your former mentor, Miss Clarissa Murch. Outside, the rain continued, and London muttered softly beneath its veil of mist. By the time we arrived, once more at number 47 Bloomsbury the next morning, the rain had given way to a brittle frost that painted the railings and window panes with fine silver. The city had resumed its hum of industry, but here, The house remained quiet, its curtains drawn, an atmosphere still weighted by the memory of Harold Phipps's sudden death. Holmes, ever precise, knocked just twice, and waited. Miss Towlishaw answered again, her expression both wary and confused at our return. "We shan't trouble you long," Holmes assured her. "We wish only to examine Mr. Phipps's private study, the one upstairs." The housekeeper hesitated. "It's locked, sir. He never allowed anyone in." Holmes produced a small brass key from his coat. "I found this tucked into the lining of his writing desk downstairs. I believe it unlocks that very room." Without further protest, she stepped aside. We ascended the creaking staircase to the upper landing. At the far end stood a plain white door, unassuming but notably free of dust around the handle, a door that had seen recent use. Holmes inserted the key, turned it with a crisp click, and the door swung open. We entered a room more austere than I'd anticipated. It bore none of the academic chaos of the study below. The shelves were sparsely populated, the desk near the window free of clutter. Everything was ordered, deliberate, but Holmes moved instantly to a small filing cabinet in the corner, already scanning the labels affixed to each drawer. "Correspondence," he murmured. "By name." He opened one drawer marked M, and withdrew a thin bundle of envelopes bound with twine. Letters from Mordaunt, some years old, others recent. He leafed through them quickly. "Here, this one is dated just 6 days before the professor's death, and it is remarkably civil." He held it out to me. I read it carefully. "My dear Harold, I cannot express how disappointed I am to hear that you continue to pursue these outlandish accusations. Your grasp of the material is, as ever, impressive, but I fear you are chasing ghosts. For the sake of our long acquaintance, let us avoid further public disagreement. Perhaps a private meeting. I remain, sincerely." I looked up. "That's hardly the language of a man fearing imminent disgrace." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "And compare the handwriting to that of the supposed final letter on Phipps's blotter." He took out the wax envelope again and held both side by side. "Close, yes, but the slant differs. Here, the professor's hand curves left, but the blotter's entry shows a slight rightward lean. A clever forgery, but careless." I nodded. "Then the forger studied Mordaunt's writing, but not enough to replicate it precisely, or had only a sample to imitate. Now, what do we have here?" Holmes had moved to a locked drawer within the desk. He produced his tool set, and within seconds the drawer was open. Inside lay only one item, a small red notebook. Its cover was creased, but its contents were pristine. Holmes flipped it open and began scanning pages. "Notes on publication disputes," he murmured. "References to primary sources. Here it is. A name. Clarissa Murch." He tapped the page. "Murch claims credit for 1847 transcription, submitted via Mordaunt. No footnote acknowledgement. Must review original manuscripts at Society Archives. Clarissa Murch." I asked. Holmes was already leafing backward. "Here as well. Murch again, unpublished work cited by Mordaunt in Linguistic Bridges of the Levant. Timeline suspicious, and once more, voice oddly familiar. Encountered her once. That's all. No further detail. Then she may have been the source of the accusations, or the person Phipps believed was being used," I said. "Or perhaps she was being erased," Holmes said grimly. "If Mordaunt or someone close to him had been appropriating her research, Phipps may have discovered the truth. Clarissa Murch becomes not merely a bystander, but a threat. Then she may be in danger as well." Holmes looked up, eyes sharp. "Precisely. Or worse, already silenced. There's only one way to know. We must find her." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sent 3 telegrams, one to the Royal Academic Society, one to the British Library, and one to a private research society based in Marylebone that occasionally published monographs by lesser-known contributors. Then we waited. It was early evening when the first reply came. Delivered by a boy in a threadbare cap. Holmes opened the envelope and read silently. "Here we are," he said. Clarissa Murch, former research assistant to Professor Mordaunt, left her post under unclear circumstances 2 years ago. Now works part-time indexing manuscripts at the British Library's East Wing. She has a residential address in Kentish Town. We wasted no time. Within the hour, we stood before a small, ivy-covered cottage on a quiet lane off Highgate Road. Lights glowed within and Holmes knocked sharply. The door opened just an inch. A cautious pair of eyes met us through the gap. "Miss Murch?" Holmes asked. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are here regarding the death of Harold Phipps." The door opened further, and the woman before us stepped into full view. She was in her early 30s, her features pale, intelligent, and marked by fatigue. She wore no ornament, save for a fountain pen clipped to her blouse, and the ink smudges on her fingertips matched those I had seen on the blotter in Phipps' study. "You'd better come in," she said. "But if you're here to ask if I killed him, I didn't. Though someone may well think I did." We entered the front room, sparse but tidy, where a kettle hissed gently on the hob. Clarissa Murch motioned to 2 chairs. "I warned him," she said quietly. "I told Harold to stop, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and too loudly." "You believe he was silenced?" Holmes asked. She looked at him, eyes narrowed. "You don't?" "We do," Holmes replied. "We believe someone used your name or your work to frame an argument against Professor Mordaunt, then murdered Phipps before he could clarify the truth." Clarissa sat down heavily. "Then it's worse than I thought." "Tell us everything," Holmes said gently. "Leave nothing out. I was Mordaunt's assistant for 4 years," she began. "I admired him at first, but he began submitting papers with passages that looked oddly familiar. Then full theories, ones I'd mentioned only in private notes. I confronted him. He said it was unintentional, that my ideas had become part of his working process, but it kept happening." "And Phipps?" I asked. "He discovered the overlap while reviewing Mordaunt's citations for a lecture series. He contacted me. I confirmed his suspicions. I thought that would be the end of it, that Harold would handle it through the proper channels. Then he vanished." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you visit him last Thursday?" "No. I'd been planning to, but I received a letter from him the day before, telling me not to come, that he had everything he needed. I kept the letter." She crossed to a writing desk and retrieved it. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me. It was calm, concise, and written in a confident hand. The same as Phipps's authentic correspondence, not the wavering lines found on the blotter. "Then the letter on the blotter was false," I said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes murmured. "And if we find who wrote it, we find the killer." Clarissa looked between us. "I think I know who could have done it. Someone very close to Mordaunt, and to me, his current assistant. Eleanor Vane." Holmes' brow lifted. "The name is familiar." "It should be," Clarissa said bitterly. "She was once my understudy." The room fell into silence, broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock, and the quiet hiss of steam escaping the kettle. Clarissa Murch sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of her modest drawing-room. Holmes, however, had gone utterly still, not with indecision, but with the tension of a predator narrowing in on prey. "Eleanor Vane," Holmes repeated slowly, savoring the name like a puzzle piece sliding into place. "Tell me about her." Clarissa exhaled. "She came to Mordaunt's department as an undergraduate, eager, brilliant in her way, but unpolished. I took her under my wing, helped her navigate the archives. She was ambitious, dangerously so. When I left my post, I recommended her as my successor. I believed she would be careful with what she inherited." "And was she?" Holmes asked. Clarissa's lips thinned. "She took more than I gave her. I later learned she'd submitted papers containing long extracts from my early notes, observations I'd never published. The same patterns began to emerge in Mordaunt's newer work, ideas too mature for a novice, yet published under his name with her assistance. I suspect they worked together, knowingly or not, and she continued feeding him my insights." "You never confronted her?" Not directly. But Harold did, she said. He told me he'd written to her, asking for clarification about the original drafts of several articles attributed to Mordaunt. He believed she had either fabricated sources or destroyed them. I frowned. And if she feared exposure, she would have reason to silence him before the accusations reached the society. Indeed, Holmes murmured, and with her academic standing tied to Mordaunt's, she would not be destroying a mere rival, she'd be defending a reputation she helped build. She's clever, Clarissa said, and poised. If you speak to her, you'll need more than questions. Holmes rose. We shall do better than that. We shall offer her what she most desires, control of the narrative. A carefully baited hook, if you will. Clarissa stood as well. I'll do whatever is needed. Holmes turned to her with a rare note of approval. Then I shall need a sample of your handwriting. Enough to demonstrate familiarity with your phrasing, but nothing compromising. If Eleanor Vane forged the final lines of Harold Phipps's letter to implicate Mordaunt and distract from herself, she likely studied your earlier notes to simulate Phipps's suspicion. Clarissa moved to her desk again and pulled a small folder from a drawer. These are copies of annotated drafts Harold and I worked on, several with my marginal notes. Holmes accepted them and offered her a small, grateful nod. Excellent. That may be all we need. Dr. Watson and I shall pay Miss Vane a visit tomorrow morning. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the contents of the folder across the table beneath the gaslight. I watched as he methodically compared loops, ligatures, pressure marks. He held Clarissa's notes beside the forged blotter lines, and then again beside the authentic letters from Phipps and Mordaunt. There, he said at last. See this formation of the lowercase d. Clarissa's script uses an upward tail that hooks slightly to the left. It's unique. And now, look here. He tapped the forged line. Mordaunt will have no defense. The D here is not Phipps nor Mordaunt's. It mimics Clarissa's style imperfectly, as if the writer had seen it, absorbed it, but didn't fully control it. I stared. Then she forged the line using Clarissa's hand. Precisely. A subtle, almost unconscious theft, a residue of past study. If she used Clarissa's notes to mimic Phipps's argument, it stands to reason she absorbed some of Clarissa's form as well. And yet it proves nothing to Scotland Yard. Oh, Holmes smiled faintly. That is why we shall not go to them. Not yet. First we confront the spider in her web. The following morning, we made our way once more to the refined quarters of Lincoln's Inn Fields. The same footman admitted us without question, and we were shown not to Professor Mordaunt's study this time, but to a small antechamber, where Miss Eleanor Vane was said to be working. It was a sunlit room lined with books, and at its center, a narrow desk upon which a neat woman sat, her sleeves rolled precisely, her pen poised above a ledger. She looked up and smiled with cautious formality. She was in her late 20s, with pale hair drawn back into a tidy chignon and a complexion as smooth as unmarked vellum. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You wished to see me. Holmes bowed slightly. Miss Vane, thank you for receiving us. We are revisiting certain aspects of Harold Phipps's final days, particularly the academic disputes he pursued prior to his death. A flicker passed over her features. A tragic loss. He was zealous. Holmes inclined his head, and deeply committed to his principles. You are familiar with his accusations against Professor Mordaunt? Her posture stiffened. I was aware of his writings, yes, but I had no personal involvement. Curious, Holmes said, studying her with a gaze so placid it seemed almost distracted. Because your name appears several times in the personal notebook he kept in his locked upstairs study. You were, it seems, his subject of increasing interest. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. He may have believed I contributed to Professor Mordaunt's work. I assure you my role is strictly administrative. Then I'm sure you'll have no objection to clarifying a small inconsistency. A letter was found on Mr. Phipps's desk, purportedly written in the last minutes of his life, and yet the ink used was a mixture of cochineal and human blood. She blinked once. That's disturbing. Quite. But more disturbing is this. The handwriting bears unmistakable influence from your former mentor, Miss Clarissa Murch. For the first time, Vane's composure slipped. Her fingers curled slightly inward, pressing into the wood of the desk. Holmes stepped closer. Why imitate her, unless the intention was to make the accusation seem born of her influence, not your own? Perhaps even to suggest she had been involved, or motivated Phipps. She said nothing. Her breath had quickened, though her eyes stayed steady on Holmes's. Miss Murch is alive, he continued, and she has retained a number of her original notes, all heavily annotated. Notes which bear a striking resemblance to the forgeries used to frame Professor Mordaunt. Still, she said nothing. Holmes let the silence hang for several long seconds. Then he leaned in ever so slightly. Your work, Miss Vane, is careful, precise. But in crafting a lie, you made a fatal error. You let admiration cloud imitation. Your forged lines bear your own habitual marks, not those of the man you pretended to echo. The trap was elegant, but your vanity betrayed you. For a heartbeat, I thought she might rise and strike him. But instead, Eleanor Vane slowly exhaled and turned her eyes toward the window. You can't prove it, she said softly. You've made a theory. Brilliant. Yes, but that's all it is. Holmes's expression did not change. No, he said, but I can arrange for the Royal Society to call a committee hearing into the source authorship of Professor Mordaunt's recent publications. If you think a forensic comparison of manuscript drafts won't yield inconsistencies, you are gravely mistaken, and you forget you left behind the most damning piece of evidence of all. What? Holmes produced a folded note from his pocket. The letter you forged. In your haste, you failed to destroy the matching ink mixture. Its chemical signature is unique, and the same residue was found in your own apartment, on the underside of your writing tray. The chemist who discovered it is willing to testify. She paled. Do not take us for amateurs, Miss Vane. You committed not a crime of passion, but of calculation, and that is where you erred. Still, she didn't speak, but the resistance in her shoulders slackened. Holmes turned away and walked to the door. I shall notify Inspector Lestrade within the hour. I expect you'll be here when he arrives. He didn't look back as we exited. Nor did I, but I could feel her gaze like a blade in the back of my coat. Once we were in the street again, I let out a slow breath. You had no sample of ink from her apartment. No, Holmes admitted, but she doesn't know that. And if she flees, she won't, he said simply. Because now she has too much to explain to too many people. And the one thing Eleanor Vane cannot endure is appearing less intelligent than she is. We hailed a cab. Fog rolled in again from the river, soft and gray, as the case began, at last to close around the ink that had tried to bury the blood. As our cab rattled away from Lincoln's Inn Fields, Holmes leaned back against the worn leather seat, his eyes half-lidded, but gleaming with thought. I could tell from the stillness in his posture that we had crossed a threshold. The case, once opaque with uncertainty, had begun to clarify itself with almost mechanical precision. Yet I knew Holmes too well to believe he considered it fully resolved. There were still loose threads, and if Holmes hated anything more than failure, it was imperfection. She will not run, Holmes said again, as if reassuring himself. Not because she is without fear, but because her pride binds her more securely than any pair of irons. And what of Mordaunt? I asked. If she acted in defense of his reputation, surely he must be culpable in some way. Holmes gave a dry, low chuckle. Ah, Mordaunt. A man whose crimes are intellectual, not legal. It would not surprise me if he encouraged a culture of appropriation without ever issuing a direct command. That, Watson, is the danger of clever men with porous morals. They never instruct, only imply. But you believe he knew? I believe he suspected. I believe he recognized in Eleanor Vane the same gift for concealment that he once found in Clarissa Murch, and simply chose to benefit from it. The cab slowed, then stopped. We were home again at Baker Street. As we climbed the steps to our rooms, Mrs. Hudson met us with a telegram in hand. Holmes took it with a murmur of thanks and tore it open at once. From Inspector Lestrade, he said, scanning the lines. Vane has not attempted to flee. She surrendered herself quietly at the yard, claims she acted alone, in a fit of desperation. A convenient truth, I remarked. Holmes gave a short nod. Yes, but it spares the professor a scandal he would not survive. And I suspect Vane prefers it that way. She'd rather be remembered as the solitary architect of an academic tragedy than the tool of a man too cowardly to wield a pen himself. He tossed the telegram onto the mantel and lit a fresh pipe. The blue smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling as the room fell quiet, save for the occasional crackle from the fire. And yet, I said, breaking the silence, there's still one thing I don't fully grasp. The blood. Holmes raised an eyebrow. I understand the ink was theatrical, symbolic, meant to dramatize the accusation. But why human blood? Why risk the forensic question at all? A fair point, he replied. The use of blood was deliberate, and I suspect more psychological than practical. Think of it. The final lines of a dying scholar's condemnation, scrawled not with ink, but with blood. It suggests urgency, sacrifice, a deathbed truth. Vane knew that Phipps's death in isolation might arouse questions. But if a letter existed, grotesque, sensational, impossible to ignore, it would direct attention firmly toward a single conclusion, toward Mordaunt. Just so. And away from herself. But it was sloppy in the end, I said. The handwriting, the ink. Holmes smiled faintly. Sloppy. Yes, but only when viewed under pressure. It very nearly succeeded. Had it not been for Major Bracknell's insistence on testing the ink, the forger's performance might have passed unchallenged. And Clarissa Murch? I asked. What becomes of her now? Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate. That is perhaps the one redemption to come from all this. With Vane's confession and the exposure of the forgery, Clarissa's contributions, long buried under the names of men, may finally see the light of day. And Mordaunt? Holmes shrugged. He will withdraw from public life. Quietly. A few committees will distance themselves. Perhaps his future papers will be received with more scrutiny. But men like him do not fall. They fade. The following day, as Holmes predicted, a small article appeared in the Times beneath the innocuous heading, Unusual Confession in Scholarly Dispute. There was no mention of forgery, nor of blood, nor of the false ink. It described Vane's arrest for obstruction of evidence and fabrication of correspondence, and noted with some delicacy that the incident was related to an academic disagreement involving the late Harold Phipps. Mordaunt's name did not appear, but in a separate corner of the paper, under the literary announcements, a notice was published by Merton and Haddock. Forthcoming, the collected notes of Clarissa Murch, with commentary by the late Harold Phipps, edited and presented by Miss Murch herself. I read it aloud that morning over breakfast. Holmes nodded once in quiet satisfaction. Justice takes many forms, he said. Not all of them dramatic, but often the most lasting is the quietest. That afternoon, Clarissa herself paid a visit. She arrived in her usual plain attire, but with a poise that had not been there before, or perhaps had simply been waiting beneath the weight of years passed in silence. I wanted to thank you both, she said, settling into the chair opposite the fire, for listening, for believing there was more to see. Holmes inclined his head. Your clarity was the fulcrum of the entire case. All we did was follow its balance. She smiled faintly. I've spent so long wondering if it was all worth preserving, my notes, my ideas. But now, even if it's only in footnotes, I'll finally be heard. Holmes said nothing more, but I noticed that he stood when she left, which he seldom did for visitors. That evening, as dusk stretched long fingers across the rooftops of Baker Street, I returned to my notes to record the events of the past week. It was, in many respects, a quieter case than those that had come before. No villain in disguise, no chase through the fog, no gunfire or locked room impossibilities, and yet, the intricacy of it, the deception forged not with weapons but with words, struck me as uniquely sinister. For what could be more dangerous than the corruption of truth itself? A murder may end a life, but the theft of a voice, of ideas, of authorship, can rewrite the past. And it had taken Holmes, with all his cold brilliance, to unearth that most subtle of crimes, the forging of a mind. Just as I was setting down my pen, Holmes spoke from the window where he stood watching the lamp's light across the city. "I find it curious," he said, "how easily the world accepts the ink upon a page as truth, and how rarely it questions who filled the ink well." I turned to him. "You think it will happen again?" "Not in the same form," he said. "But yes, so long as there are minds worth stealing, there will always be hands willing to steal them." And with that, he turned away from the window and vanished again into the comforting silence of smoke and thought. 3 days passed with an unusual quiet. Holmes, having concluded the affair with Miss Vane to his own satisfaction, retreated into one of his brief, self-imposed isolations, alternating between cryptic chemical experiments and obscure monographs on ancient ciphers. I, for my part, resumed my practice, and even accepted a dinner invitation or two, enjoying the comparative calm that followed the storm. It was not until the 4th evening, as I returned from a patient visit in Kensington, that I found Holmes seated by the hearth, violin in hand, but silent, his brows drawn in contemplation. There was an envelope, thick and creamy, resting on the mantel. A wax seal bore the crest of the Royal Academic Society. "You've had correspondence?" I asked, removing my gloves. Holmes nodded slightly. "It appears we are not quite finished with the matter, Watson." I frowned. I thought Vane's confession settled it. It settled the act, perhaps, but not the motive. "Read this." He passed the letter to me. It was from the secretary of the society, a Sir Edgar Lanesborough, a name I knew only vaguely, though it carried weight among the scientific elite. The tone was formal, but troubled. Sir Edgar requested Holmes's presence at a private meeting, citing concerns that certain revelations following Miss Vane's arrest had cast a longer shadow than anticipated. It concluded with a rather pointed sentence: "There remains a matter of sequence and omission which we hope you may illuminate." I looked up. "They're not asking for a report. They're afraid." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "The society prides itself on its integrity, but it seems something has unsettled the foundation. Something Miss Vane did not, or would not confess, and they believe you can uncover it. I can try. More to the point, I believe I already know what they suspect, though I would prefer confirmation before I pronounce." The next morning found us seated in the wood-paneled boardroom of the Royal Academic Society, surrounded by oil portraits and the quiet scent of old vellum and polish. Sir Edgar, a lean, dignified man with a hawkish nose and precise diction, greeted Holmes with the air of a man seeking both solution and absolution. "We are in a bind, Mr. Holmes," he said once we were seated. "Miss Vane has confessed to forging the final letter. That is clear, but certain details in her confession do not align with records in our possession." "Such as?" Holmes prompted. Sir Edgar withdrew a folded document and passed it across the table. It was a list, brief and neatly typed, headed Archives Access Log, Manuscript Room B, week ending March. "Miss Vane claims she visited the archives on the 10th, Sir Edgar said, to consult the original translation drafts of Professor Mordaunt's Bridges manuscript. However, our logs show she never signed in." "And who did?" Holmes asked. Sir Edgar pointed. "Only 3 names. One is Clarissa Murch, another is Harold Phipps, the third is Professor Mordaunt." Holmes took the list and studied it with sudden intensity. 3 names, all tied directly to the controversy. And the date, March 10th, that's 2 days before Phipps's death. Exactly. We now believe all 3 were here that morning, and may have crossed paths, but no one declared such a meeting. Holmes tapped his fingers against the table. "Then we are no longer discussing forgery alone. We are dealing with concealment." Sir Edgar nodded gravely. "That is what we feared, and it puts us in an impossible position. If a confrontation occurred, and it led, even indirectly, to Mr. Phipps's death, then our records become evidence. The society becomes part of the scandal." After a pause, Holmes said, "You wish me to determine whether the chain of events was set in motion here, And by whom, precisely? We left the society at noon and stepped into the brisk sunlight of Gower Street. Holmes walked quickly, his cane tapping against the stones in rhythm with his thoughts. At last, he turned to me. "The answer is in what Phipps saw," he said. Something he found in the archive that made him confront not just the authorship of an idea, but its provenance, and I suspect he did not merely see it, he took it, something small. A note, a marginal comment, perhaps a discarded draft, Clarissa's or his own. Something that would disprove Mordaunt's authorship once and for all. And if Vane discovered he had it, she would act, Holmes said, desperately and with haste. But what if she wasn't alone? What if someone else knew? You think Mordaunt was there, not just coincidentally, but because he knew Phipps would be, or feared he might be. Perhaps Phipps sent him a letter, warning of what he'd uncovered. Perhaps he intended to confront both Mordaunt and Miss Murch, and that confrontation may not have gone as expected. By late afternoon we had returned to Clarissa Murch's cottage. She welcomed us in with a wary expression that shifted to surprise when Holmes asked not about Eleanor Vane, but about the archive visit. "I didn't mention that before," she said. "I didn't think it mattered. I was there to compare some of my earlier work with published editions. I didn't know Harold would be there." "But he was," Holmes said. "Yes. We spoke briefly. He said he'd found something, but he wouldn't say what. Only that it would prove everything. I assumed he meant notes. Something from years ago." He was elated. Was Mordaunt there as well? Clarissa's brow furrowed. "I saw someone who might have been him, tall, with a cane. But he didn't speak. I was too focused on my own papers." Holmes nodded. "And afterward, I left around noon. Harold said he'd stay longer." "Miss Murch," Holmes said gently, "did you ever keep correspondence between yourself and Mordaunt? Letters, drafts, disagreements?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, but most of it is still in the Society's archives. We were asked to deposit all formal academic exchanges 10 years ago. It was part of a transparency initiative." Holmes gave a tight smile. "Then what Phipps found may not have been a manuscript, but a letter. Something Mordaunt wrote, perhaps never expecting it would be read again. A letter proving he had read or even lifted Clarissa's work." I asked. "Precisely." Holmes stood. "Then we must return to the archives. Tonight, if possible." The following hours saw us back in the hushed corridors of the Royal Society's archival vaults. The night clerk, long familiar with Holmes's reputation, granted us access with minimal hesitation. Within room B, lit only by green-shaded lamps and the creak of the occasional hinge, Holmes moved with an almost reverent purpose. He located a thin folder labeled C. Murch, H. Mordaunt, Correspondence 1879, 1884, and extracted a yellowed envelope. "Here," he whispered. The letter inside was brief, but damning. In it, Mordaunt acknowledged receipt of a translation draft from Miss Murch, expressed admiration for her linguistic theory on cognate structure, and ended with a telling sentence: "It may find a place in time. Among my own expanding treatise, your discretion, as always, is appreciated." Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully. "This is what Phipps found. This is what he meant to publish. And this," I said, "is what Vane or someone else needed to suppress." Holmes nodded. "It was not the ink that revealed the blood, Watson. It was the blood that threatened to reveal the ink." He replaced the letter gently and turned to leave, the soft footfalls of his steps echoing in the vault behind him. The damp night air clung to us as we emerged from the archives into the deserted courtyard of the Royal Academic Society. A fine mist hovered near the gas lamps, scattering their glow into halos. Holmes paused by one of the stone columns, the collar of his coat raised against the chill, his expression drawn not with triumph but with a kind of grim inevitability. "That letter," I said, still stunned by the implications. "It proves Mordaunt not only received Clarissa's work, but intended to absorb it into his own." Holmes nodded slowly. And it places the motive directly into his hands. Until now, we suspected he was a passive beneficiary of Vane's actions. This changes that. He was not simply complicit in the theft of ideas, he was its architect. But if the letter was in the archives, I said, and not in Phipps' possession at the time of his death, how could it have factored into the crime? Phipps must have removed it, or made a copy. Holmes replied. He wouldn't have confronted Mordaunt on a mere hunch. He had evidence. Perhaps he returned the letter before his death to avoid suspicion, or perhaps someone replaced it afterward. You think Mordaunt retrieved it? Holmes considered this. Unlikely. He would never have risked entering the archives again so soon after the murder. No. The person who returned it likely did so to contain the damage. Someone who had access. Someone who knew how to quietly replace a document without drawing attention. I felt a shiver of realization. Eleanor Vane, indeed. She may have found it on Phipps' person, after his death, or among his belongings, and once she realized the scope of what it revealed, she returned it to the archives, believing it would be lost in the sea of institutional silence. But she confessed to the forgery, I said. She never mentioned the letter, because the forgery was theatrical, Holmes said. A bluff. But the letter, that was the real danger. And she feared, perhaps rightly, that if the society discovered its existence, they would not stop at her. Then she was protecting Mordaunt. To the last, Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on a distant point in the fog, as if weighing something beyond the facts. At last he said, or protecting herself. Guilt has many disguises, Watson. Loyalty is often one of them. We returned to Baker Street well past midnight. I half expected Holmes to retreat into silence again, but he surprised me by pouring 2 brandies and settling near the fire. The case, though in many ways resolved, had reached a deeper knot, one that couldn't be untied by mere evidence. What will you do with the letter? I asked. Nothing, Holmes said quietly. For now. I started. But surely, if we present it publicly, we destroy the Royal Academic Society's credibility. Clarissa's name, newly vindicated, will be tangled in fresh scandal. Mordaunt will fall, yes, but so will the institution that preserved his illusion for decades. Worse still, it would drag Miss Murch's name through yet another controversy, one she may not survive. You mean to bury it? I mean to hold it in trust, Holmes said. There may come a time when it must be revealed, but not by us. And not yet. Mordaunt will step away from public work. Vane will face trial. The truth is secure, if not visible. It was, I confess, a difficult thing to accept. My instinct, as a man of medicine and principle, was to see the truth applied like a poultice, directly and without delay. But Holmes saw the world differently. He understood, in ways I often could not, that timing was as much a part of justice as the facts themselves. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Major Bracknell arrived just past 10, bundled against the wind and bearing the firm set of a man determined to see something through. I've come to thank you, he said, once settled. Harold's sister received word yesterday. The inquest has been reopened. Scotland Yard now believes the death may have been the result of unlawful interference. A slow turn, but the right one, Holmes said. Bracknell inclined his head. I wanted to ask privately what truly happened to Harold. The official report won't say, I suspect. Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Then in a quiet voice he told him. The forgery, the ink, the false letter, Clarissa's stolen ideas, and the letter in the archives that had nearly vanished into history. Bracknell listened without interruption, his military composure unmoved, save for a tightening at the corner of his mouth. When Holmes finished, the Major rose. I'll not speak of it to others, if that's your wish, but I thank you. You've given me something no one else could. Clarity. Harold died for a truth, and now I can see that it mattered. After Bracknell departed, Holmes stood at the window once more, pipe in hand, watching the street below. Will they believe the forgery was the whole of it? I asked. They will, Holmes said. And for most, that is sufficient. But not for you. No, he admitted. But it will do. The days that followed were filled with the usual domestic rhythm of Baker Street: consultations, correspondence, the occasional newspaper clipping passed beneath our door. Eleanor Vane, as predicted, entered a formal plea of guilty to charges of falsifying evidence and obstruction. Her connection to Mordaunt was neither confirmed nor denied. Mordaunt himself announced an indefinite sabbatical for reasons of health. And Clarissa Murch? Her book was published within the month. Slim, elegant, and filled with the quiet confidence of a voice long stifled. It earned modest praise in scholarly circles, but more importantly, it bore her name, and no one else's. One evening, shortly after the review appeared in the Literary Gazette, she came to visit again. Holmes greeted her with a brief but respectful bow, and I served tea while she offered quiet thanks. "I owe much to both of you," she said. "I know this story didn't end as neatly as it might have, but I feel free in a way I never expected." Holmes gave her a rare, full smile. Truth does not always arrive with fanfare, but when it does, it often stays. As she left, Holmes turned to me with a look I had come to recognize, not satisfaction, but resolution. "Write it all down, Watson," he said. "Even the part about the letter we did not reveal, especially that part. Let the record show that truth was found and chosen." And so I did. Even now, years later, when I look back upon the case of the ink that revealed blood, I see it not as a tale of murder alone, but of something quieter and more insidious: the theft of intellect, the silencing of voices, and the subtle courage it takes to restore what has been lost. For not all crimes leave bruises. Some bleed only onto the page, and not all heroes wear laurels. Some simply sign their name at last, and do so without apology. The spring sunlight filtering through the windows of 21B Baker Street bore none of the gloom that had haunted the early days of the case. Yet the warmth it promised did not fully dispel the lingering questions that remained behind Holmes's steady, contemplative gaze. Though justice or something very near to it had been achieved, I knew from the way Holmes handled his pipe without lighting it, that his mind still wandered back through the corridors of that shadowed affair. Clarissa's name was restored. Vane had confessed. Mordaunt had retreated. The letter, that damning slip of arrogance preserved in the archives, remained untouched, folded like a blade. Holmes kept hidden beneath his coat. And yet, I sensed he had not quite closed the ledger. We were sitting quietly one afternoon, a week after Clarissa's visit, when a knock sounded at the door, brisk, impatient, authoritative. Mrs. Hudson let the visitor in, and a moment later, Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand, and brow furrowed. Holmes gestured to the armchair opposite him. "You're here on the matter of Eleanor Vane." "Partly," Lestrade said, sitting down. "Though the courts will handle her soon enough." "No, I've come because something's gone missing." Again, Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Missing from where?" "The Society," Lestrade said. "Archives Room B." A page from the correspondence file. Clarissa Murch's folder. I leaned forward, a chill rising up my spine. "The letter?" "No," Lestrade said. "Not the one you found. A different one. Earlier, dated 2 years before that. Less incriminating perhaps, but still relevant. It was reported missing yesterday during a quiet audit, one conducted after the board decided to re-catalog their sensitive holdings." Holmes remained very still. "Describe it." Lestrade unfolded a small sheet of paper from his pocket. From what they've reconstructed, it was a brief thank-you note. Mordaunt to Clarissa. He acknowledged her translation of a Phoenician funerary inscription and said it would complement his own evolving thesis. He called her indispensable, not dramatic but suggestive. "Who discovered it missing?" Holmes asked. "A new archivist. Young fellow, diligent. The Society believes it was removed sometime within the last week. They've had only a handful of people in and an out, researchers, a handful of junior staff. Anyone connected to the case. Lestrade hesitated, then said, "That's the other part. Vane's solicitor requested access, claimed it was for the defense. The visit was logged, but brief. She was permitted to view the files but not remove them. Still, the page is gone. She did not act alone." Holmes said softly, "Not from the beginning." "No." Lestrade agreed. "But if Mordaunt had his hand in it, he's not likely to confess now. I never expected him to," Holmes replied. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Holmes stood, brushed the ash from his sleeve, and crossed to his desk. He opened a drawer, the one in which I knew he had placed the more damning letter, and removed the envelope. He held it gently, not unlike a priest might hold a relic, and then turned to Lestrade. "Take this," he said. "It will complete the picture." I blinked. Holmes. But he held up a hand. "The truth, Watson, must sometimes be timed. But it must never be buried." We gave the players space to retreat. Now someone seeks to erase history again. And that I will not permit. Lestrade accepted the envelope with a solemn nod. "You're sure?" Holmes's voice was quiet, but clear. "I am." After the inspector left, Holmes returned to his seat and picked up his violin. He didn't play it, merely turned it over in his hands. "You once said," I ventured, "that truth without context can cause more harm than lies." Holmes gave a soft breath of amusement. "And I believe it still. But we now have the context, Watson. Mordaunt's silence, Clarissa's resilience, Vane's confession. They've filled in the gaps the public will never see. The letter will now do what it was always meant to do, not to destroy, but to complete the story." I said nothing more. I had learned long ago that Holmes's conclusions, once reached, were rarely swayed by sentiment. 2 days later, the Times published a short column under the heading, "New Evidence Emerges in Phipps's Inquiry." It did not name Clarissa Murch, nor describe the exact content of the recovered letter, but it noted that historical correspondences between members of the Society, long preserved in archives, revealed discrepancies in authorship previously unacknowledged. The phrase was careful, but the implication was unmistakable. The weight of academic authority had shifted just slightly toward transparency. Mordaunt, it was said, had vacated his post entirely. His name vanished from the editorial boards of several journals. No dramatic scandal followed, but neither did any further publication. Clarissa sent no note, and we did not expect one. Her absence was its own message. She had, at last, no need to defend what she had built. As for Vane, her trial concluded with a sentence of confinement and probation. There was talk of her turning state's witness in future academic inquiries, a role she seemed strangely eager to adopt. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps she wished to preserve some claim to legacy even now. On a late April morning, Holmes and I sat once more in our familiar armchairs. Outside, the city stirred. Omnibuses trundling, boys shouting the news, the scent of coal smoke mingling with early flowers. Holmes was reading the British Review of Linguistic Antiquity, a new issue, and to my mild surprise, one that included a review of Clarissa Murch's volume. "Well?" I asked. He looked up. "They have, at last, acknowledged her." "In full, in tone," Holmes replied, "which is often the better currency." He folded the journal and set it aside. "We often speak of justice as a verdict, a punishment, but it is also a restoration of balance, of voice. In this case the voice was long silenced. We simply cleared the way for others to hear it again." I nodded slowly. "You believe she'll be remembered?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that memory is a fragile thing, Watson. But when anchored to truth, it endures." He turned to the window then, where the late morning light spilled in golden patterns across the floor. The case was over, not with thunder or dramatic arrests, but with ink, blood, and the steady hand of a man who believed that no truth, however delicate, should remain hidden forever. And I, for once, closed my notebook, not with a final line, but with quiet certainty. The ink had revealed blood, and the blood had revealed far more than guilt. It had shown the cost of silence, the courage of persistence, and the enduring power of a name written, at last, in its rightful hand. The rain had returned by the time we reached the last pages of the affair, not the heavy, dramatic rain that drenches coat hems and patters with urgency, but the soft, steady kind that polishes cobblestones and draws a gentle hush over London's usual din. I remember thinking, as I watched Holmes at the window, that this was the weather best suited to endings, contemplative, clean, and just faintly sorrowful. Clarissa Murch's name was by then spoken in academic halls with respect, even reverence. Her book, modest in tone but groundbreaking in content, had become a touchstone. Holmes had predicted as much. A woman whose intellect outlasted those who tried to use it, he said when I remarked on the accolades she had quietly begun to receive. That is the surest form of legacy. Vane had vanished from public view. Her sentence, lenient in the eyes of many, included a strict prohibition on future academic publication, and yet there had been whispers of anonymous essays, unsigned letters to editors, and even a hint that she was assisting a barrister, researching the ethics of intellectual property. Whether out of penance or pride, Eleanor Vane remained a ghost in the wings of a stage she once hoped to command. And Mordaunt? He retired. Officially, the reason was illness. Unofficially, his silence was understood by those who had once stood beside him. The Society, shamed but intact, made no formal declaration, merely amended a few footnotes, updated a few citations. The correction of the record, Holmes observed, often proceeds more quietly than the error that first distorted it. But the final piece, the one Holmes had kept to himself until the very last moment, came not from the archives, nor from the courts, but from a drawer in Holmes's own desk. We were sitting by the fire, some weeks after Lestrade's visit, when Holmes finally drew out the single remaining item that he had withheld from the rest of us. It was a single page, folded twice, the paper brittle with age. Across the top, in Phipps's distinct, hurried hand, was a note addressed not to the Society, nor to Clarissa, but to Holmes himself. If anything should happen to me, I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to see that this letter is made known to those who can see justice done. You are not a man of books, perhaps, but you are a man of truth. That is enough. I stared at the letter, awestruck. You never mentioned this, I said quietly. Holmes offered a slight, rueful smile. Because I wasn't sure it would ever be necessary, but in the end, it wasn't. The truth revealed itself by other means. What was he referring to? What letter? Holmes turned the page over to reveal the rest. A carbon copy of the damning note from Mordaunt to Clarissa, dated and signed in the professor's own hand. He had it all along, Holmes said. A copy he made during his first visit to the archives. He didn't confront Mordaunt immediately. He wanted to be sure. It was only after cross-referencing it with Clarissa's notes that he understood the depth of the theft. He died for this, I said, barely above a whisper. Yes, but not in vain. Holmes carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in his drawer. You see, Watson, sometimes the final act in a crime is not violence, but silence. And the greatest threat to those who steal ideas is not exposure, but the persistence of those they tried to erase. And what becomes of it now? I asked. Nothing, he said. It will remain there, where it belongs. The world now believes what it must. Clarissa is vindicated. Phipps is remembered not as a bitter man but as a seeker of truth. And Mordaunt, whether guilty in full or in part, has faded, not hounded, not condemned, but eclipsed. Outside, the rain had begun to taper off, leaving thin rivulets on the glass. Holmes lit his pipe, then leaned back with a look that suggested, for once, peace. You know, Watson, he said, in most cases I solve, someone ends in chains. This time, no cell was needed. The weight of the truth was punishment enough. I closed my notebook, the final page now filled, and for once, I did not ask the usual question. What next? There was no need. Holmes would always find the next riddle, the next lost thread. But this story, the one written in ink and sealed in blood, had reached its final line, and it read, in the clear, unshakable hand of justice, "Truth endures.